The Zags don't have any real traction for recruits in the 2024 class, but 2025 is looking like a potentially big year for the Bulldogs, and we will tell you why on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 in your pocket if your team wins. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. We're going to discuss Gonzaga at number 23 in the AP poll. We're also going to talk about the Gonzaga women's team moving up to number 16. But first, figure it's a good opportunity to talk a little bit about Gonzaga's recruiting updates right now. We haven't heard much on what's going on with Gonzaga recruits after Zoom Diallo announced his commitment to Washington in December. But On3, one of the premier recruiting services, them alongside 24/7 Sports and Rivals are kind of the three premier basketball recruiting services, ranking systems, whatever you want to call them. They did an update to their 2025 class rankings, have expanded it all the way out to 150 prospects in that 2025 class. Felt like a good opportunity to kind of revisit who Gonzaga is pursuing in that class, where they are at with those players, what it might mean for the program going forward. So as many of you know, the 2024 class right now has not yielded any actual results for the Zags. They have no players committed in 2024. Zoom Diallo was a top target. He has since committed to Washington. Bit of a surprise. Most felt he was going to go to Arizona. Isiah was a top tier prospect for Gonzaga as well. He ended up going to Georgia. And the Zags haven't really made a lot of other offers in 2024. A part of that is the simple fact that Gonzaga has a mostly full roster. They do have a couple of open scholarships, but the only player on this roster who will not be here next year guaranteed is Anton Watson, who is, of course, out of eligibility after this season. So I think Gonzaga is content to not pursue prospects in 2024 unless they feel like they are immediately going to come in and compete for minutes immediately, which Isiah certainly would have as a replacement for Watson. Zoom Diallo certainly would have as one of the best point guard prospects in the class. But if they're not seeing anybody else they think is going to come in and immediately contribute, I can kind of understand why they would rather fill those remaining roster spots with transfers, adding somebody in the portal next offseason. They, of course, have youth at multiple positions with Dusty Stromer as a freshman, with Luka Krajinovic as a freshman point guard, with Pavle Stosic and Braden Huff as freshman big men. So I can kind of understand there's not a lot of urgency to add more youth to the roster. I think that's the best way for those who are concerned about not having any prospects in 2024, I think that's probably the best way to look at it. And then I think the fact that Gonzaga has been very active in pursuing top-end talent in the 2025 classes is an indication that this team isn't just abandoning recruiting from a high school perspective. They're just picking and choosing the moments and the classes and the years where I think they want to make an impact. So for 2025, right now, the Zags have 5 offers, known offers, according to On3, according to 24/7, that are out there right now. We've only really talked about 2 players because, frankly, they're the only 2 in this class that feel like they could end up in Spokane. Both of them are favored right now at On3 to go to Gonzaga, not necessarily meaning they will, just meaning that Gonzaga is the front runner right now, whereas the other 3 players are not being given particularly high odds of coming to Spokane. In fact, some of them have already even released top lists that don't include Gonzaga, so it seems very unlikely they will end up there. But I think it's a good reminder that Gonzaga isn't just offering Isiah Harwell and Nick Khamenia, who we will talk about momentarily. They do have offers out to other players as well, even if it is unlikely at this point that those players are going to end up playing in Spokane in 2025. So we'll start with Harwell. He's the most known of this group, the most talked about out of this class right now. He is now up to number 5 in the class of 2025, again, according to On3, he was at number 8. So right now, again, according to On3, he is a top 5 prospect in what is considered a very solid recruiting class in 2025. 2023 was considered a very weak class. 2024 is not considered a particularly strong class, but 2025, as of right now, of course, these things change as we see the classes continue to grow and develop. But as of right now, is considered a strong class, and Harwell's a top 5 player in that class. A 6'5" combo guard from Pocatello, Idaho. He is scheduled to visit for the St. Mary's game on February 3rd. That will be an official visit to Spokane to visit the Zags, to come to that game against St. Mary's. Hopefully it's a good game. Obviously, St. Mary's hasn't played up to their expectation this year. Frankly, neither has Gonzaga, so it might end up being a good competitive game. It usually is when we take on Randy Bennett and the Gales, so that could be a great opportunity to help convince Harwell that Spokane and Gonzaga is the place for him to be. On3 does do percentage odds that they kind of do for every prospect. 24/7 Sports does the crystal ball. All these sites kind of have different ways of making predictions and projections, and I don't try to take them too seriously, not because I think that the people who make those projections are being misleading or anything like that. High school players change their mind. So the information they're getting that says, hey, I think there's a X percent chance that so-and-so is going to this school, that just doesn't mean that much to me, because the player may change their mind. Like Zoom Diallo, I don't think that people were being fed bad information that indicated he was probably going to go to Arizona. I think Zoom just changed his mind, and there's nothing wrong with that. Maybe Coach Hopkins made a late push. Maybe there was an NIL shift. Maybe he just felt like he wanted to stay at home. Who knows? So I don't want to put a ton of stock into those numbers. Having said that, Harwell is currently being given 46% odds to come to Gonzaga. Next up is 14% odds for BYU, which feels particularly odd since Harwell made a top 9 that includes Gonzaga and does not include BYU. So I'm not really sure why BYU has the second highest odds on their ranking system. Perhaps it's an oversight. Perhaps they know something we don't. I don't know the situation there, but it's hard to not feel at least a little bit optimistic that a top 5 recruit, he'd be one of the highest regarded recruits in Gonzaga basketball history, alongside Jalen Suggs, alongside Zach Collins, alongside Chet Holmgren, of course, alongside Hunter Salas, Nolan Hickman, that a player of that caliber, of that recruiting rank, is being given good odds to come to Gonzaga, and the schools below him on the list don't seem to even be in consideration right now. So certainly feeling pretty good about where the Zags are at with Harwell, knowing, of course, that the visit in February is going to be a big make or break moment for the Zags in this recruiting opportunity. Next up is Nick Khamenia. We've talked about Khamenia quite a few times on the podcast. 6'7" small forward from Harvard Westlake High School. He played AAU basketball with Gonzaga walk-on Colby Brooks. He's now up to the 41st ranked player in the class. He was 48th, so he's moving up gradually up the list. Gonzaga has a history of being early in on recruiting players who end up moving up those lists. They have a very good eye for talent. If they did not, they would not be at the level that they are as a program right now. On3 is giving Gonzaga 78% odds of landing Khamenia. Basically, that's because nobody else is super seriously in the running. UCLA has made an offer. They've spoken to him. But right now, Khamenia has taken an unofficial visit to Gonzaga back at Craziness in the Kennel in 2022. He took an official visit to Gonzaga at Craziness in the Kennel in 2023. He's been on campus twice. He has not taken any other official visits. This feels like a pretty good likelihood that we will get an announcement that Khamenia is coming to Gonzaga anytime soon. Those of you who are everyday listeners, you know I've said that on the show before, and we have not heard anything. I don't think that's necessarily bad. It's not necessarily great either. It's just we haven't heard anything yet. 2025 is a long time from now. Some kids commit early, some don't. He may feel like Gonzaga is the place to go. He just may not want to commit yet. That's okay. That may be the situation that we're in right now with Khamenia, but a kid who's almost top 40 in his class, already crossed the threshold as a top 50 player, 6'7", can space the floor a little bit. There's a lot to like about who Khamenia is as a prospect and a good target for the Zags. A few other players the Zags, have targeted, have made offers to. Again, none of them are feeling like they're very likely to be Zags in the future. One of them is Jalen Harrelson. He went from number 9 to number 12, so he's just outside the top 10 in the class of 2025. He's a 6'7" combo guard from Anderson, Indiana, and Indiana is the heavy favorite right now. The other schools on the list are Auburn, Purdue, Ohio State, Michigan, and Notre Dame. So it feels like he's staying in that kind of Big Ten area. Every school on here is Big Ten except Auburn, who is in the SEC, of course, and Notre Dame. So I feel like it's not likely he's coming all the way across the country to Spokane, but still a good player for Gonzaga to have had some contact with. If nothing else, perhaps he's in the transfer portal in a few years. One of the Zags' most recent offers was to Efiosa Oliogu, who went from 31 to 34 in the class of 2025. He's a 6'5" guard from Markham, Ontario. Of course, we know the Zags love their Canadians, so they have a nice pipeline, which could help them potentially land somebody like Oliogu, even with a late offer. He's currently at Overtime Elite, and Providence, Missouri, and Maryland are all given over 25% odds at On3. So it certainly feels like he has a list of 3 schools that he's heavily considering right now. Zags not given a lot of optimism based on the way On3 is pursuing it right now. But again, they very recently got involved with Oliogu's recruiting, so you never know. Perhaps they could pull a late flip here. And then last is Jeremiah Fears. He went from 35 all the way down to 51 in the latest update. 6'3" point guard from Joliet, Illinois, the younger brother of Josiah Fears, who plays at Michigan State. Jeremy Fears, who plays at Michigan State. Was recently involved in a gun-related incident, unfortunately. It sounds like he's recovering okay, so that's good news for him. Michigan State is considered one of the schools that Fears is interested in. They're not the front runner necessarily. Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, Alabama, Kansas, Providence, Oregon, Ole Miss, and Arizona round out his top 10. So a very eclectic group of schools right there for Fears. So none of them being Gonzaga. So probably not coming over to Spokane again. The Zags, though, making offers to some top tier talent in the 2025 class. I think a lot of people have had concern that, Gonzaga is not even trying to pursue top tier talent. And that's not true. That's not true. Obviously, if they strike out 0 for 5 on these players, we're going to have a little bit more panic, a little bit more concern. I have been on record multiple times of not being overly concerned about Gonzaga's recruiting right now. They're picky, they're choosy. If they don't like anybody in 2024 outside the guys they offered, I think that's fine. I think that's understandable. But at this point, it'd be really nice to get a win with either Khamenia or Harwell, or of course, the ideal scenario, they land both of them, get themselves 2 premier top 50 prospects in that 2025 class. Will certainly make people feel a lot less concerned about the lack of talent in that 2024 class. Well, the Zags are up to number 23 in the AP poll after a pair of blowout wins in WCC play. Is that where they belong? We're going to talk about that and more coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Jace Medical. I know we come to sports to escape from some of the crazy realities of life, but can we talk for a minute about preparing for when real life happens? Because according to the FBA, pharmacies are running out of antibiotics like amoxicillin right in the middle of the worst flu season in over a decade. And I can't imagine a more helpless feeling than if someone I loved was getting sick while a supply chain issue kept them from the life-saving medication that they needed. Thankfully, there's Jace Medical. The Jace case is a pack of 5 different antibiotics to treat a long list of bacterial illnesses, including UTIs, respiratory infections, sinusitis, and skin infections, among others. This could happen to anybody. So visit jacemedical.com and complete your physician encounter. It will be reviewed by a board-certified physician, and your medications will be dispensed by a licensed pharmacy at a fraction of the regular cost. It's never been more important to be prepared than today. So go to jacemedical.com and use offer code LOCKEDON to get $20 off your order. All right, folks, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast, moving away from an update on the 2025 recruiting class and talking about the AP poll, which of course came out on Monday, as it always does. The Zags have climbed 1 spot. Last week, they dropped all the way down to 24, barely held on to a spot in the top 25 in a streak that has now spanned many, many years for the Zags of being inside that top 25. And now they get a little bit more room removed from the very bottom of the list, moving from 24 to number 23 after, of course, the big win over Pepperdine on Thursday and the win over San Diego on Saturday. It helped that not only, of course, Gonzaga taking care of their own business by winning 2 games. It also helped that a lot of the teams around Gonzaga lost. At the start of conference play tends to expose a lot of teams that end up in the top 25 because they haven't lost, or they've only lost 1 or 2 games, but they haven't really played anybody good yet. And we've sort of seen that with a few teams. James Madison and Ole Miss were undefeated going into Saturday. Both those teams lost to teams. Ole Miss lost to Tennessee, but they got walloped by Tennessee. James Madison lost to Southern Miss, a not particularly good team in their own conference. And neither of those teams were really looking like actual top 25 teams. They were just in the top 25 because they were undefeated. Now that they've lost, both I think are outside the top 70 at KenPom. So they have fallen out of the top 25. There's a chance they stay outside the top 25 for a while. Meanwhile, Florida Atlantic fell all the way down to 24. They took their 4th loss of the season. This one to Charlotte on the road. Charlotte's a quad 2 loss, so it's not terrible for FAU, but they already got 2 quad 4 losses on their resume against Bryant and against Florida Gulf Coast. I'm a little surprised the Owls are still ranked with 2 quad 4 losses and 4 total losses. That feels like a resume that's maybe not quite top 25 worthy. Of course, they have that win over Arizona and a handful of other really good wins as well. Texas fell to number 25. I'm very surprised that the Longhorns are still ranked. They're 60th in the net. They don't have any quad 1 wins. Of course, neither does Gonzaga, but Texas is 9-0 in quad 4, and they basically have very few quad 2. They have 2 combined quad 2 and quad 3 wins. So not a particularly good resume for Texas. A little surprised they're still in, but that is a decent sign for Gonzaga as Texas takes on Cincinnati on Tuesday night. That could be a loss for the Longhorns. That could push them out of the top 25. Granted, it would probably push Cincinnati, who just beat BYU. If they beat BYU and Texas in their first 2 ever Big 12 games, they will probably be into the top 25. But the question now is whether 23 is the right spot for Gonzaga. And for me, it is. I do my top 25 as part of a aggregation for Locked On College Basketball. Myself, my co-host Isaac Shade, our regular guest Leaf Tulane, each do our own top 25, and we aggregate them into the Locked On College Basketball top 25. I had them 22. So for me, that's about right, I think. I had them out after last week. I brought them back in again because of so many other teams around them losing. Providence also lost. There's a handful of teams that were kind of right at the bottom of my top 25 that ended up losing and falling out of that conversation. So for Gonzaga, even though we expected them to beat Pepperdine, we expected them to beat San Diego, blowing them out certainly helps. The confidence around this team is better. The three-point shooting is better. The vibes are better around Gonzaga right now. And vibes are not how you should make your AP top 25. I understand that, but certainly it makes this team feel more like they are a top 25 team. And I think that having them in the bottom half of the top 25, the bottom portion outside the top 20 is kind of where I feel like they belong. They deserve to be right now. And they got plenty of more opportunities to move up. KenPom has them 23rd. So certainly kind of in that same conversation. As we talked about already, they are 0-4 in quad 1 games. They don't have any opportunities to pick up quad 1 victories until February when they take on St. Mary's. So it's going to be a while till they get that opportunity, but then they get Kentucky and then they'll get San Francisco, which may end up being a quad 1 game. So there's some opportunities for Gonzaga to put themselves in positions to pick up some of those quad 1 games, as long as they avoid any quad 3, quad 4 losses, which is basically everybody else in the WCC. Don't lose games you can't lose. Don't lose on Thursday to Santa Clara. That would be a bad one for them, even though Santa Clara is a decent team and it's a decent road opponent. It's a quad 4 loss if they take it right now. So that's a kind of game that Gonzaga needs to avoid losing. If they can do that, they should continue to climb in the top 25, even if they stay around where they are now. I think hanging on to a spot around the 20 to 25 range still puts them in a good position heading into St. Mary's and Kentucky. And obviously that Kentucky game is going to be critical because right now that's the only ranked opponent left on Gonzaga's schedule. They've got 0 wins over ranked teams, 0 quad 1 victories. Of course, Kentucky is number 6 right now after beating Todd Golden and the Florida Gators on the road. They went to Gainesville. It was a close game. They only ended up winning by 2. They were up by 4, and freshman guard Reed Shepherd, for some reason, fouled a 3-point shooter from Florida with literally a half a second left. It was a tremendously dumb foul by Reed Shepherd. It didn't end up costing them the game, but it did end up narrowing the gap, the margin of victory to just 2 for the Wildcats. Regardless, they're 17th in the net. They're 11-2 on the season. They got a quad 3 loss to UNC Wilmington. Outside of that, their resume is very sparkly, very good. Gonzaga going to have a really hard time going into Rupp Arena and winning. Not a lot of people do that, but it's a great opportunity for the Zags, win or lose, to at least get some valuable experience against a really, really good team, play in a hostile road environment. Of course, a victory would be a monumental swing in momentum for Gonzaga heading towards March. And like we said, no wins over ranked teams right now. Unlikely to have any of their wins be against ranked teams. I don't think USC and UCLA are ever going to sniff the top 25 this year. They're having, frankly, horrendous seasons. UCLA more so than USC. We could do a whole segment on Who did Mick Cronin blame this week for his team losing? Because he's blamed his NIL collective, he's blamed his freshmen, he's blamed just about everybody but himself for his team being one of the worst Power 6 teams in all of college basketball. USC is a little bit more likely to right the ship and look better as the year goes on, but I'd be pretty surprised with their resume right now if they were back in that top 25 conversation. Now, for Gonzaga, their losses, the Washington loss is far and away the worst one, but there are other losses. Purdue's the number 1 team in the country. UConn is the number 4 team in the country, and San Diego State has held steady as being the 19th team in the country. So 3 totally acceptable losses for Gonzaga. The Washington loss, again, hurts, but it's a road loss against a rival. I don't think it's that bad of a loss. It's just unfortunate for Gonzaga. They really needed to. You didn't want to take all 4 of those losses, and not having any quad 1 wins is obviously problematic for Gonzaga's resume at this point, but they got plenty of opportunities to right the ship. And as we've talked about, the increase in the outside shooting has been a nice boon for this team, and the usage of Graham EK has made this team feel like a much more well-oiled machine at this point in conference play, and they got an opportunity to pick up what would be a nice win over Santa Clara on Thursday. We're going to close out the show discussing Lisa Fortier's team. They are up to number 16 in the AP poll after a blowout win over last year's WCC champions, the Portland Pilots. We're going to talk about that after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. As the weather gets colder, the college basketball offers, they stay hot on FanDuel. And right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 in your pocket if your team wins. So if you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there is no better time than right now to get in on the action. The app is super easy to use. There is a wide range of betting options, which include spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. And since we're about to talk about the Lady Zags, they are at 10,000 to 1 odds to win the national championship. To quote Kevin Malone from The Office, you give me 10,000 to 1 odds on anything, I'm taking it. And that is where I'm at here with the women's basketball team. If you want to join me, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get in on the action this college basketball season. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, closing out the show today, talking about Lisa Fortier and the women's basketball program. They're up to number 16 in the AP poll. They were 18th last week, so a steady climb, approaching the top 15, maybe even approaching the top 10, depending how the rest of the season goes, how some of those teams around them end up faring in their own conferences. But for Gonzaga, their resume continues to be boosted by Stanford. Of course, they beat Stanford earlier in December, or early part of December at home. Monster victory for the Lady Zags. And it was one of the biggest defeats that Stanford had taken in, I think, 4 years in terms of margin of victory. Just a monster performance from Vonnie Ejim, from the Trung Twins. Just a really, really great game. And Stanford hasn't lost. Outside of that game, they are 14-1. They are number 8 in the AP poll. They're one of the top teams in the net. This is one of the best teams in college basketball. And the Zags got a victory over them. And I think that is continuing to help boost their resume, even while Gonzaga is at the point in their schedule where they don't have a lot of high-level competition left. But the Lady Zags only have 2 losses. Their 2 losses are to Louisville, who's number 15, 1 spot ahead of them in the top 25. They also have that loss to Washington State. Wazoo was ranked earlier in the year. They have kind of fallen out of that conversation, didn't even receive any votes this week, although they are 22nd in the net. So still a quality program being built over there in Pullman, but that loss is not doing super well for Gonzaga's team just because that program has fallen off a bit. But if that's your only loss, and to Louisville, a top 15 team, you got that win over Stanford, you can see why Gonzaga's resume, why their spot in the AP poll is in a good spot right now. But the margin of error continues to be razor thin, and that's not going to change for this program throughout the year. I don't think there's any team in the WCC that's magically going to put themselves in a position where a win for Gonzaga helps them, or where a loss by Gonzaga doesn't hurt them. That's just not the reality of the situation. Right now, the second best team per net in the conference is Santa Clara. They're 66th in the net, so a road game there would be a quad 1. They don't pay as much attention to the quads, how the quad situation works for on the women's side. But Portland's 3rd, and they're at 104th. So there are only 2 teams in the top 100 in the women's basketball net rankings right now. Again, Gonzaga is up in that conversation, and then Santa Clara. Gonzaga's 18, Santa Clara 66, Portland 104, Pacific 146. That's it in the top 150. This is not a good conference on the women's basketball side, and Gonzaga has to take care of business. There is very little room for error, little margin for error for this team, but so far so good. because they're 1-0 in conference play. Their first game was at Portland, the team that beat them in the Orleans Arena last year to earn the automatic bid out of the WCC into the NCAA tournament. Gonzaga, of course, still earned a bid, but they fell to a 9-seed, lost in the first round to Ole Miss. And Gonzaga wanted some revenge against the Portland Pilots. Now it's a new look Portland team. Portland lost a ton of talent from that roster last year. Some players entered the transfer portal, a few graduated. As a brand new looking team, and Gonzaga went out again at the Child Center and took them down 74-53, 21-point margin of victory for the Zags here. Must have felt good to get a win over a team that hurt them the way that they did last year. And the Zags won despite a not particularly pretty game in any side for them. They only shot 37% from the field, 25% from three. They had 13 turnovers. That is not typically a recipe for success for any basketball team, but they were good enough defensively. Portland was held to under 33% from the field. Portland also only shot 11% from three and was 59% from the free throw line. Just lots and lots of misses for the Portland Pilots. So even though Gonzaga wasn't knocking their shots down, even though they were turning the ball over, they were still able to get a victory. Big part of that was the rebounding advantage, 32 for Portland. They also had 19 offensive rebounds, second chance points, massive opportunity for the Zags to build and maintain that lead over Portland. Vonnie Ejim, 18 points, 5 boards, 3 steals, and 2 assists. She did all that in just 19 minutes because she fouled out of this game. Meanwhile, Brenda Maxwell, 21 points, 7 boards, 4 assists, and 2 steals for her on 7 of 11 shooting. Brenna went 3 of 4 from 3 in this game. Guys, the rest of Gonzaga's team went 1 of 12. 1 of 12 for players on Gonzaga's team not named Brenna Maxwell. Thankfully, she was there to knock down her shots, have a productive offensive night, and help lead the Pilots to a big victory. Now they host Santa Clara. This game will be on Thursday while the men's team is away at Santa Clara. The women will be at home playing the Broncos. Again, starting off WCC play against the 2 teams that beat them last year. Portland beat them in the WCC tournament. Santa Clara beat them in the regular season. Now, Lady Zags got an opportunity to avenge those 2 losses with the win here on Thursday against the Broncos. They are 13-3 on the year. They are 1-0 in conference play. They had a win over Pacific by 3, 80-77 was the final score there. This Broncos team has some quality wins. They got a win over Kelly Graves and the Oregon Ducks. They got a win on the road at Arizona State in the Pac-12. They also got a win over Boise State. Their losses are at Cal. And now Gonzaga did beat Cal, so that's a good sign for Fortier's team. They also have a loss at Oregon State and a home loss against Texas Tech. So a good opportunity for Lisa Fortier's team to pick up another victory, move to 2-0 in the WCC. They got San Diego on Saturday. Not a particularly great program, so good chance we're looking at this women's team being 3-0 in WCC play heading into next week, where perhaps they will move into the top 15 of the AP poll, establish themselves in a good spot to potentially earn a really nice seed in March, assuming they can continue to take care of business in a weak WCC this year. Going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. I want to thank all of you for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Remind you can join us on our Discord channel where we're talking Gonzaga basketball 24/7. There is a link in the show notes on either audio or video platform. You can hang out with us there. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back later this week with more stuff on the WCC. We'll talk about the preview of that Santa Clara game, of course, review it as well and get us into the weekend, all right here on Locked On Zags. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, as always, go Zags.